Hidden within the very fabric of our existence lies a code, a genetic narrative that stretches back tens of thousands of years. This isn't just biology. It's the raw, unfiltered story of humanity etched into our DNA. And nowhere is this story more profound, more complex, and more pivotal than in the DNA of the Middle East. This region isn't just a crossroads of continents, it's the original meeting point of civilizations, where human history didn't just pass through, it was born. Picture this, the Middle East, a land where ancient empires rose and fell, where languages emerged, and where cultures collided. But beneath the ruins of forgotten cities and layers of shifting sands lies something even more enduring. Genetic footprints that have survived wars, migrations, and the rise and fall of kingdoms. Every strand of Middle Eastern DNA carries echoes of a time when humanity was still writing its first chapters, long before history found its way onto paper. Here's the astonishing part. Middle Eastern DNA doesn't just reflect the past, it rewrites it. Scientific discoveries reveal that Arabians carry elevated levels of Basal Eurasian ancestry, a lineage so ancient and distinct that it dilutes traces of Neanderthal DNA, setting them apart from the rest of the world. This isn't just a genetic anomaly, it's evidence of a deeper, older connection to humanity's earliest expansions. But the story doesn't end there. The region's DNA holds clues to survival against catastrophic climate events, like the 4.2 kilo-year aridification that triggered societal collapse across civilizations. It whispers of migrations that shaped the Semitic languages spoken today and of ancient adaptations, like the lactase persistence gene, that allowed people to thrive in harsh desert environments. Middle Eastern DNA isn't just special, it's the biological testament to human resilience, migration, and transformation. It holds secrets that challenge what we thought we knew about our species and connects us to a history far older and richer than we ever imagined. The Middle East isn't just a region marked on a map, it's the birthplace of humanity's most defining chapters. Long before cities rose, before written words captured history, and before borders carved the world apart, this land was where our story truly began. Archaeological discoveries reveal that some of the earliest modern humans ventured out of Africa through the Middle East, leaving behind tools, fossils, and, most importantly, traces of their DNA. Imagine standing in the Arabian Peninsula, where ancient footprints were once pressed into soft, wet earth during a time when the region wasn't a desert but a thriving, green landscape. This was Green Arabia, a vital corridor for human migrations during humid periods over 100,000 years ago. These migrations weren't random, they were lifelines, driven by climate shifts that transformed deserts into grasslands, inviting early humans to explore, settle, and adapt. Their genetic signatures are still embedded in the people of the Middle East today. But the Middle East wasn't just a bridge, it was a destination. Populations didn't just pass through, they stayed, evolved, and shaped the course of human history. The DNA of modern Middle Easterners carries echoes of these ancient settlers, linking them directly to the earliest communities that left Africa. What's remarkable is how this DNA reveals not just movement but survival, stories of adaptation to dramatic climate shifts, from lush savannas to unforgiving deserts. Moreover, this region witnessed one of the most transformative events in human history, the Neolithic Revolution. This wasn't just the birth of agriculture, it was the dawn of civilization itself. As people transitioned from hunter-gatherers to farmers, their genetic diversity shifted, marking a turning point that shaped societies across the globe. The Levant, Mesopotamia, and the Arabian Peninsula became genetic melting pots where ancient lineages mixed, creating the complex tapestry we see in Middle Eastern DNA today. This isn't just history, it's living history. Every genetic marker, every sequence, is a relic of the first footsteps humanity took as a species. The Middle East holds the biological blueprints of humanity's origins, not locked away in museums, but alive within the people who walk its streets today. The Middle East has always been more than just a region. It's the intersection where continents, cultures, and civilizations collide. But beneath its ancient cities and shifting borders lies an even deeper connection, its DNA. The Middle East isn't just a historical crossroads, it's a genetic one, where the threads of human ancestry from Africa, Europe, and Asia have been woven together over tens of thousands of years. Picture the Arabian Peninsula thousands of years ago. Not the arid desert we know today, but a lush, green expanse, teeming with life and welcoming waves of human migrations. This land acted as both a bridge and a destination. Early humans migrating out of Africa passed through the Middle East, but many stayed, mingling with local populations, leaving behind genetic footprints that still echo in the region's people today. But the story doesn't end with these first migrations. Over millennia, waves of new populations arrived: Persians, Greeks, Romans, Turks, and countless others. Each migration brought not just new languages, customs, and beliefs, but also new genes. The Middle Eastern genome is a dynamic record of these encounters, where ancient hunter-gatherer lineages mix with the DNA of Neolithic farmers, Bronze Age traders, and medieval conquerors. It's a living mosaic, reflecting thousands of years of human movement and interaction. Yet, despite this incredible mixture, the Middle Eastern genetic landscape isn't chaotic. It holds patterns, distinct signatures that trace back to ancient civilizations. For example, the people of the Levant carry genetic links to early farmers from Anatolia and ancient Iranians, while Arabian populations show strong ties to local Epipaleolithic hunter-gatherers, reflecting their deep-rooted presence in the region long before recorded history. What's even more fascinating is how these migrations and mixtures shaped not just who Middle Easterners are, but how they've adapted to their environments. Genes that helped ancient ancestors survive harsh climates, resist diseases, or thrive on specific diets have been passed down through generations. Some of these genetic adaptations, born from ancient migrations, still influence health, resilience, and even physical traits today. The Middle East isn't just a place where history happened. It's where humanity's genes met, mingled, and evolved. Its people carry in their DNA the echoes of journeys that shaped the world, making the Middle East not just a crossroads of history, but a crossroads of human identity itself. Beneath the sands of the Middle East lies more than the remnants of lost cities and forgotten empires. Hidden in ancient bones and preserved fragments of the past is a genetic story that connects us to people who walked this land thousands of years ago. Ancient DNA isn't just about uncovering history. It's about discovering the echoes of those ancient lives that still live within us today. When scientists began extracting DNA from ancient skeletons found in the Levant, Arabia, Mesopotamia, and beyond, they unlocked a time capsule of human history. These genetic clues revealed surprising truths. For instance, the Natufians, one of the world's earliest known sedentary cultures from around 12,000 years ago, weren't just ancestors of people in the Levant. They left genetic traces that stretch far beyond, influencing the DNA of populations across the Middle East and even parts of North Africa. But the story goes deeper. As ancient farmers from Anatolia and Iran spread agriculture across the region during the Neolithic period, they didn't just bring crops and livestock. They carried their genes with them. These migrations weren't simple replacements of local populations. Instead, ancient DNA shows a complex web of mixing between these early farmers and the indigenous hunter-gatherers already living in Arabia and the surrounding areas. This blend created unique genetic signatures still found in modern Middle Eastern populations. Then came the Bronze Age, a time of massive cultural and technological change. Empires rose and fell. Trade routes stretched across continents, and people moved like never before. The ancient DNA from this period reveals significant population shifts, especially with the arrival of groups carrying ancestry linked to ancient Iranians. This wasn't just a migration. It was a transformative wave that reshaped the genetic landscape of the Middle East, leaving its mark on both the Levant and Arabia. What's truly remarkable is that despite these ancient upheavals, the genetic continuity in the region remains strong. In places like Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and Oman, people carry lineages that trace back to local Epipaleolithic hunter-gatherers, populations that predate the agricultural revolution itself. These ancient genetic threads have been woven through time, surviving climate shifts, migrations, and the rise and fall of civilizations. Ancient DNA doesn't just connect us to the past, it challenges the narratives we thought we knew. It reveals that the Middle East wasn't just a passive crossroads of civilizations, it was an active, dynamic center of human evolution. Its people aren't simply descendants of one migration or one culture. They are living reflections of thousands of years of movement, adaptation, and survival. In the vast tapestry of human genetics, certain threads stand out, distinct patterns woven deep into our DNA that tell stories of survival, adaptation, and migration. In the Middle East, these threads form a unique and intricate design, marked by genetic signatures found nowhere else on Earth. These markers aren't just scientific data points. They are living echoes of ancient journeys, environmental shifts, and cultural transformations that have shaped the region for millennia. One of the most striking genetic markers in Middle Eastern populations is found in the Y chromosome, passed from father to son like an unbroken chain through generations. Haplogroup J1, for instance, is a signature deeply rooted in the Arabian Peninsula. It's believed to have spread during the Bronze Age, potentially linked to the migrations that carried the Semitic languages across the region. What makes it even more fascinating is its diversity within the Middle East, reflecting ancient expansions and local adaptations that occurred thousands of years ago. Then there's the lactase persistence gene variant, which tells a story of how culture and environment can shape our biology. Unlike the well-known European variant, the Middle Eastern version of the lactase gene allows adults to digest milk, a crucial adaptation in arid environments where dairy from camels and goats became a vital source of nutrition. This genetic trait, particularly common in Arabian populations, reflects a powerful example of natural selection driven by lifestyle changes during the shift from hunter-gatherer societies to pastoralism. Another unique marker is the Duphanol allele, especially prevalent in populations from Yemen and southern Arabia. This gene variant offers protection against certain strains of malaria, an evolutionary shield forged in response to ancient battles with disease. Its high frequency in specific Middle Eastern groups hints at historical interactions with African populations and the environmental pressures that shaped human survival in the region. But it's not just about individual markers. The Middle Eastern genome carries layers of ancient ancestry, traces of Natufian hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers from Anatolia and Iran, and even the echoes of early human migrations out of Africa. This deep ancestry contributes to a rich genetic diversity, with variants that influence everything from metabolism and immune response to physical traits like skin pigmentation and height. What's remarkable is how these genetic signatures remain distinct despite centuries of migrations, conquests, and cultural blending. The Middle East has always been a crossroads of civilizations, yet its people have preserved unique genetic legacies that speak to both continuity and change. These markers are silent witnesses to histories written not just in books but in the very code of life itself. Across the shifting sands and ancient landscapes of the Middle East, human footsteps have traced paths for tens of thousands of years. But these journeys didn't just shape history. They are etched into the very DNA of the region's people. The genetic makeup of modern Middle Eastern populations is a living record of ancient migrations, conquests, and cultural exchanges that span continents and millennia. The earliest waves began with the first modern humans migrating out of Africa around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. These early pioneers passed through the Middle East, leaving genetic imprints that still linger today. Interestingly, despite the region's proximity to Africa, there's no significant trace of the very first human expansions in the DNA of present-day Middle Easterners. Instead, all non-African populations, including those in the Middle East, seem to descend from a single, later migration that carried early humans across the globe. Fast forward to the Neolithic period, about 10,000 years ago, when humans transitioned from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled agricultural societies. This era brought dramatic changes, not just in culture but in genes. Farmers from Anatolia and the Levant spread their agricultural knowledge and, with it, their DNA. Yet, in Arabia, populations maintained smaller, isolated communities, suggesting that local hunter-gatherer ancestry persisted alongside Neolithic influences. This divergence is still visible in the genetic distinctions between Levantine and Arabian populations today. The Bronze Age marked another pivotal chapter. Around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, waves of migration carried people with ancient Iranian ancestry into the Levant, Egypt, East Africa, and Arabia. This movement wasn't just a trickle of gene flow. It was transformative, replacing nearly half of the local ancestry in some regions. These migrations likely played a role in spreading Semitic languages, with genetic footprints that align with the timelines of linguistic expansion across the Middle East. But migrations didn't stop there. The rise and fall of empires, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, Roman, Islamic, each left genetic echoes. The Arab expansions following the rise of Islam carried Arabian genes into North Africa and even into parts of Europe. Trade routes connected the Middle East with sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and beyond, introducing new genetic lineages through both voluntary and forced movements of people. These ancient migrations are visible in specific genetic markers. For example, the presence of African ancestry in Arabian populations, especially among Yemenis, reflects historical connections through trade and migration across the Red Sea. Meanwhile, the spread of Y-chromosome haplogroups like J1 and E1b1b trace male lineages back to distinct migration events tied to ancient population movements. What's truly fascinating is how these layers of migration have shaped not just the diversity of the Middle East, but also its genetic resilience. The region's genome is like a mosaic, each piece representing a different time, place, and story, woven together by the ceaseless movement of humanity across deserts, mountains, and seas. Around 4,200 years ago, the Middle East faced a climatic catastrophe that would ripple through both history and human DNA. This event, known as the 4.2 kiloyear aridification, wasn't just a dry spell. It was a prolonged period of severe drought that led to the collapse of some of the world's earliest civilizations. But beyond the crumbling cities and fading empires, this environmental disaster left a mark hidden deep within the genetic code of the region's people. The 4.2 kiloyear event struck at the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, triggering agricultural failures, mass migrations, and societal collapse. Cities that once thrived on fertile riverbanks were abandoned as rivers dried up and farmlands turned to dust. But while history records the fall of kingdoms, genetics captures the human story that unfolded in the aftermath, the bottlenecks, the migrations, and the reshaping of populations. When scientists examined the genetic history of Middle Eastern populations, they noticed a striking pattern, a severe reduction in population size around the same time as the aridification event. This genetic bottleneck wasn't a coincidence. As drought devastated the region, communities shrank, people migrated in search of more hospitable lands, and isolated populations became even more genetically distinct. Arabian populations, in particular, show evidence of this bottleneck. Their effective population sizes plummeted to levels far lower than those of neighboring Levantine groups. This sharp decline reflects how harshly the desertification impacted the Arabian Peninsula, turning once green, habitable areas into the vast arid landscapes we see today. In contrast, populations in the Levant and Mesopotamia managed to sustain slightly larger numbers, likely due to access to rivers like the Euphrates and Tigris, which provided some refuge from the worsening climate. But it wasn't just about population decline. The crisis also triggered waves of migration, reshaping the genetic landscape. As communities dispersed, they carried their DNA into new territories, mixing with other populations and introducing new genetic lineages. This period may have fueled the spread of Semitic languages, as groups moved across the Middle East, from the Levant into Arabia and beyond, intertwining linguistic and genetic histories. Interestingly, while the bottleneck reduced genetic diversity in some areas, it also set the stage for unique genetic adaptations. Isolated populations, struggling to survive in arid environments, may have developed specific traits that helped them cope with extreme conditions, though the full extent of such adaptations is still being uncovered. The 4.2 kiloyear event reminds us that climate change isn't just a modern concern. It has shaped human history for millennia, influencing not only where people lived but also who they became. Today, the genetic echoes of that ancient drought are still present in the DNA of Middle Eastern populations, a silent testament to humanity's resilience in the face of environmental upheaval. Hidden within the complex genetic tapestry of the Middle East is a mysterious thread known as Basal Eurasian ancestry. This ancient lineage holds the key to understanding why Middle Eastern DNA is distinct from that of neighboring regions. Basal Eurasians were a population that branched off early from all other non-African human groups, before those groups interbred with Neanderthals. This early divergence has left a profound impact on the genetics of modern Middle Eastern populations. Unlike other Eurasian populations who carry traces of Neanderthal ancestry due to ancient interbreeding events, Basal Eurasians seem to have avoided this genetic exchange altogether. As a result, regions with high Basal Eurasian ancestry, like parts of the Middle East, exhibit noticeably lower levels of Neanderthal DNA compared to Europe and East Asia. This absence isn't just a genetic quirk, it's a window into a time when different human populations were taking divergent paths across the prehistoric world. Arabian populations, in particular, carry elevated levels of Basal Eurasian ancestry. This explains why their genomes show less Neanderthal influence, not because they lack contact with Neanderthals, but because their ancestors had already diverged from the groups that experienced that interbreeding. It's as if the Basal Eurasians remained in a genetic safe zone, isolated from the mixing events that shaped the rest of Eurasia. But how did this unique ancestry become so prominent in the Middle East? The answer lies in the region's complex demographic history. After the initial out-of-Africa migration, Basal Eurasian-related populations likely settled in parts of the Middle East, maintaining a distinct genetic identity even as waves of other migrants moved through the area. Later, as ancient civilizations rose and fell, these Basal Eurasian lineages persisted, blending with incoming populations but never disappearing entirely. What's even more fascinating is how this ancestry influences modern genetic studies. Basal Eurasian ancestry acts like a genetic time capsule, preserving information about a population that lived tens of thousands of years ago but left little to no archaeological trace. By studying its distribution, scientists can infer ancient migration patterns, population splits, and even the movements of early humans before written history began. This unique ancestry also challenges traditional narratives about human evolution. It suggests that the story of human migration isn't a simple, linear journey out of Africa into the rest of the world. Instead, it's a complex web of branching paths, isolated populations, and ancient genetic legacies that continue to shape who we are today. Basal Eurasian ancestry is more than just a scientific term. It's a reminder that deep within our DNA lie traces of ancient people whose stories have been forgotten by history but preserved in our very genes. The Middle East, with its vast deserts, rugged mountains, and ancient river valleys, is more than just a cradle of civilization. It's a region where climate has been a powerful force, sculpting not only the landscape but also the very DNA of its people. Over tens of thousands of years, shifts in climate have triggered dramatic changes in human migration, population size, and even genetic adaptations that are still visible today. Around 6,000 years ago, the Middle East underwent a significant transformation. The region that was once lush and green, teeming with wildlife and human settlements, began to dry up. This event marked the onset of the current desert climate that dominates the Arabian Peninsula. But long before that, the region experienced alternating cycles of arid and humid periods, often referred to as the Green Arabia phases. During these humid times, vast stretches of the Arabian desert were covered in grasslands, rivers flowed freely, and early humans thrived, migrating across what are now inhospitable wastelands. These climatic shifts didn't just change where people lived, they influenced who survived and how they adapted. The 4.2 kiloyear aridification event, a severe drought that occurred around 4,200 years ago, caused widespread societal collapse in ancient civilizations from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. But its impact went deeper than crumbling cities. It triggered a genetic bottleneck in Middle Eastern populations. This means that population sizes shrank dramatically, reducing genetic diversity and amplifying certain genetic traits that help people survive harsh conditions. Arabian populations, in particular, show evidence of having maintained small population sizes during these dry periods, possibly deriving ancestry from local Epipaleolithic hunter-gatherers who had already adapted to extreme environments. These adaptations weren't just cultural. They were written into their DNA. Genes related to metabolism, dehydration resistance, and even skin pigmentation may have been influenced by the relentless pressure of surviving in arid climates. The Neolithic transition, when humans shifted from hunting and gathering to farming, also left its mark. In the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of agriculture, populations expanded rapidly, supported by stable food supplies. In contrast, parts of Arabia remained sparsely populated, as the arid environment limited the spread of farming. This divergence created distinct genetic signatures between Levantine populations, who experienced population booms, and Arabian populations, who maintained smaller, more isolated communities. Climate also shaped migration patterns. As green corridors opened and closed with the changing climate, waves of people moved in and out of the Middle East, bringing new genetic lineages with them. African ancestry found in Arabian genomes today can be traced back to migrations during humid periods when the Arabian Peninsula acted as a bridge between continents. Similarly, ancient Iranian-related ancestry spread into the region during times when climate shifts made new areas habitable, influencing not just the gene pool but possibly the spread of languages and cultures. Even today, the echoes of these ancient climatic events are present in Middle Eastern DNA. Traits that once helped people survive in hot, arid environments may now influence susceptibility to modern diseases like diabetes and hypertension, showing how our evolutionary past continues to shape our health. The Middle East's genetic landscape is, in many ways, a reflection of its climate history. It's a story written not just in ancient ruins and shifting sands, but deep within the DNA of its people, a testament to how humanity has adapted, survived, and thrived in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. The Middle East is often called the cradle of civilization, home to ancient empires like Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, and Persia. But the true legacy of these civilizations isn't just in the ruins of ziggurats or the faded scripts carved into stone. It's embedded deep within the DNA of the people who live there today. Every ancient migration, every empire that rose and fell, left behind genetic footprints that tell a story far older than written history. Modern genetic studies have revealed how deeply the roots of ancient civilizations run in the Middle East. By comparing contemporary Middle Eastern genomes with ancient DNA extracted from archaeological remains, scientists have traced lineages back thousands of years, connecting people today to ancestors who lived during the Neolithic, Bronze Age, and even earlier. This genetic continuity is astonishing, especially when you consider the region's complex history of invasions, migrations, and cultural shifts. Take the Sumerians, for example, the creators of the first known writing system. While their language has no direct descendants, their genetic legacy persists. Ancient DNA from the region of southern Mesopotamia shows similarities with the genomes of modern Iraqi populations, indicating a strong genetic continuity despite millennia of upheaval. Similarly, the Assyrians, whose empire once stretched across much of the Near East, left a genetic imprint still visible in today's Assyrian communities, who carry unique markers tracing back to their ancient ancestors. The Levant, too, holds a rich genetic tapestry woven from the threads of countless civilizations. Modern Lebanese populations, for instance, carry substantial genetic material from the Canaanites, an ancient people who flourished over 4,000 years ago. When researchers analyzed ancient Canaanite genomes from Sidon and compared them with modern Lebanese DNA, they found that more than 90% of the genetic makeup remained consistent, despite later conquests by Egyptians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. But it's not just continuity that defines the region's genetic history. There's also a story of admixture, where populations merged, blending their genetic traits. The Bronze Age collapse, around 3,200 years ago, was a time of widespread societal disruption across the Middle East and Mediterranean. This period coincided with significant population movements, as people fled collapsing cities and migrated across regions. The genetic evidence shows new lineages appearing in the Middle East during this time, likely brought by these migratory waves. One of the most profound genetic influences came from ancient Iran. The spread of Iranian-related ancestry during the Bronze Age reshaped the genetic landscape of the Middle East. This influx wasn't just a result of invasions or conquests. It reflected complex processes of migration, trade, and intermarriage over centuries. Remarkably, the timing of this genetic shift overlaps with the spread of Semitic languages, suggesting that population movements played a role in linguistic as well as genetic transformations. Egyptian influence also left its mark, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. Genetic links between ancient Egyptians and populations in these regions reflect both ancient trade networks and later periods of Egyptian rule. Even the expansion of the Roman Empire, which might seem like a distant event in genetic terms, introduced Mediterranean genetic influences that are still detectable in the Levant and parts of Arabia. What's fascinating is how these ancient layers of ancestry coexist within modern populations. The people of the Middle East today carry within them the genetic echoes of hunter-gatherers from the Epipaleolithic, early Neolithic farmers, Bronze Age city-builders, and the diverse cultures that followed. Each wave of migration, each rise and fall of an empire, added new threads to the genetic fabric without completely erasing the old. This continuity and complexity challenge simple narratives about identity. The genetic legacy of the Middle East reveals a region defined not by isolated populations, but by connections across time, geography, and cultures. It's a living history, written not just in ancient texts or carved into stone monuments, but carried in the very DNA of its people. When modern humans first ventured out of Africa around 60,000 years ago, they encountered Neanderthals, our closest evolutionary cousins, who had been living across Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. These encounters weren't just fleeting meetings. They resulted in interbreeding, leaving behind a genetic legacy that most non-African populations still carry today. Yet, there's something puzzling. Middle Eastern populations have consistently been found to have lower levels of Neanderthal ancestry compared to Europeans and East Asians. Why is that? The answer lies in a complex interplay of ancient migrations, deep ancestral lineages, and more recent population dynamics. First, it's essential to understand that the initial admixture with Neanderthals likely occurred soon after modern humans left Africa, somewhere in the Middle East or nearby regions. This would suggest that Middle Eastern populations should have similar, if not higher, levels of Neanderthal DNA. But genetic studies tell a different story. One key factor is the presence of Basal Eurasian ancestry in Middle Eastern populations. Basal Eurasians were an ancient population that split from other non-African groups before those groups interbred with Neanderthals. Essentially, Basal Eurasians represent a lineage that left Africa early but never mixed with Neanderthals, or if they did, it was at negligible levels. Over time, as Basal Eurasian ancestry mixed into populations across the Middle East, it diluted the overall proportion of Neanderthal DNA in the gene pool. In fact, the more Basal Eurasian ancestry a population has, the less Neanderthal ancestry it tends to carry. This explains why Arabian populations, who have higher levels of Basal Eurasian ancestry, show less Neanderthal DNA compared to Levantine populations or Europeans. Interestingly, ancient DNA from Neolithic Iran and the Natufian culture of the Levant shows high Basal Eurasian ancestry, and these genetic components are still prominent in modern Middle Easterners. Another factor is the impact of African admixture. Over the past few thousand years, there have been significant gene flows from Africa into the Middle East, especially into the Arabian Peninsula. African populations, having diverged from Neanderthals long before any interbreeding occurred, carry virtually no Neanderthal DNA. So, when African and Middle Eastern populations mixed, this further reduced the Neanderthal genetic signal in Middle Eastern genomes. This effect is particularly noticeable in populations like Yemenis and Saudis, who have higher levels of recent African ancestry. But there's more to the story. The unique demographic history of the Middle East also played a role. Populations in the region have undergone bottlenecks, periods when the population size dramatically decreased, such as during the aridification events around 4,200 years ago. These bottlenecks can reshape genetic diversity, amplifying some lineages while reducing others. As a result, certain Neanderthal-derived genetic segments might have been lost over time simply due to random genetic drift. Moreover, natural selection could have influenced the retention, or loss, of Neanderthal DNA. Some Neanderthal genes were beneficial to early humans, helping with immunity or adaptation to new environments. But other genes were harmful and were gradually purged from the gene pool. The Middle East's unique environment, with its harsh deserts and distinct pathogens, may have led to the selective removal of certain Neanderthal genes that weren't advantageous in that context. What's fascinating is that despite having less Neanderthal DNA overall, Middle Eastern populations still retain unique Neanderthal-derived genetic segments that are rare or absent in other parts of the world. This suggests that while the quantity of Neanderthal DNA may be lower, the diversity of these genetic fragments tells its own story about ancient interactions and survival. Ultimately, the reduced Neanderthal ancestry in Middle Eastern populations isn't a simple matter of less interbreeding. It's a reflection of deep ancestral lineages, complex migrations, population bottlenecks, and natural selection, all woven together over tens of thousands of years. It's a reminder that human history isn't written in straight lines, but in the intricate patterns etched into our very DNA. The Middle East, a region often romanticized for its deserts and ancient civilizations, holds within its DNA the echoes of dramatic climate shifts that have shaped not just the land, but the very people who inhabit it. From lush, green landscapes to arid deserts, the story of how climate changes influenced human genetics here is both fascinating and profound. Tens of thousands of years ago, the Middle East wasn't the vast, dry expanse we know today. During periods known as Green Arabia phases, triggered by shifts in Earth's orbit, monsoon rains transformed the Arabian Peninsula into a land rich with rivers, lakes, and grasslands. These fertile windows, occurring roughly 125,000, 85,000, 55,000, and 10,000 years ago, served as corridors for human migration, drawing early hunter-gatherers out of Africa and into new territories. These migrations weren't random wanderings. They were pivotal events that left a lasting mark on the genetic fabric of Middle Eastern populations. As humans moved into these greener landscapes, they mingled with existing groups, creating complex layers of ancestry. But these hospitable periods didn't last. The climate eventually shifted back to aridity, forcing populations to either adapt to harsher conditions, migrate elsewhere, or face extinction. This climate-driven cycle of expansion and contraction shaped the genetic diversity we see today. Populations that adapted developed unique genetic traits, while those that migrated carried Middle Eastern genetic signatures far beyond the region. One of the most significant climate events was the 4.2 kiloyear aridification event, around 4,200 years ago. This wasn't just a drought. It was a catastrophic shift that collapsed ancient civilizations like the Akkadian Empire and disrupted societies from Egypt to the Indus Valley. Genetic evidence reveals that this period also caused population bottlenecks, where numbers dwindled dramatically. Such bottlenecks reduce genetic diversity because only a small group of survivors pass on their genes. In Arabian populations, this led to a sharp decline in genetic variability, while Levantine groups experienced a plateau in growth before recovering. Interestingly, while these bottlenecks reduced diversity, they also amplified certain genetic traits. For instance, genes related to heat tolerance, dehydration resistance, and even metabolic efficiency may have become more common, as individuals with these traits were more likely to survive in the harsh, arid conditions. But it's not just ancient droughts that left their mark. The Neolithic period, around 10,000 years ago, brought another climate shift, a warming trend that allowed agriculture to flourish in the Fertile Crescent. This new way of life led to population booms, urbanization, and massive migrations. Genetic studies show that Neolithic farmers from the Levant spread not only their agricultural practices but also their genes across the Middle East and into Europe. However, Arabia tells a different story. Despite proximity to the Fertile Crescent, Arabian populations didn't fully adopt farming. Instead, many maintained a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, hinting at a more complex interaction between environment, culture, and genetics. Another layer in this genetic tapestry comes from ancient Iranian ancestry. As the climate became drier post-Neolithic, migrations from regions like ancient Iran introduced new genetic lineages into the Middle East. This ancestry appears in the Levant first, around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, then spreads into Egypt, East Africa, and Arabia. Interestingly, this migration pattern overlaps with the spread of Semitic languages, suggesting that climate-driven movements may have influenced not just genes, but cultures and languages. Moreover, the transition from a humid to arid climate around 6,000 years ago didn't just alter the landscape. It also triggered selective pressures on human populations. In Arabia, for example, genetic variants associated with lactose tolerance became more prevalent, likely due to the reliance on pastoralism and milk consumption as agriculture became less viable. Similarly, genes related to salt retention and water balance would have offered survival advantages in desert environments. Even today, the genetic echoes of ancient climate changes are visible. Middle Eastern populations exhibit unique genetic adaptations linked to their ancestors' struggles with shifting climates, whether it's in genes that influence hydration, metabolism, or even disease resistance. For instance, certain genetic markers in Arabian populations are associated with adaptations to extreme heat and limited water, traits that likely trace back to ancestors who survived in increasingly arid environments. Ultimately, the story of the Middle East isn't just written in stone ruins or ancient texts. It's etched into the DNA of its people. Each gene carries the memory of migrations fueled by green landscapes, bottlenecks triggered by catastrophic droughts, and adaptations born from the relentless challenge of survival. The region's genetics are a testament to humanity's resilience in the face of one of nature's most powerful forces, climate change.